Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our webinar this morning. We're going to give people a little bit of a chance to join, and then we'll get started. So again, good morning and welcome to our webinar. And my name is Aaron Mann, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Clinical Research Data Sharing Alliance. Today, we've got, we hope will be a very lively, moderated conversation. We're going to have Rebecca Lee from Vivly start us off with a few words, and then I'll give a little bit of an overview of CRDSA and the white paper that we just released. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time in conversation with Liz Roberts from UCB and Luke Arbuckle from Privacy Analytics, as well as take audience questions. So we're really excited about this. We've got a great panel today with Luke and Liz, and I think this will be lively. I encourage you to add questions to the Q&A using the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca Lee for a few remarks to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Hi, everyone. I'm a founding board member of CRDSA, and I'm also the executive director of Vivly. I'm really delighted to be able to sponsor this webinar on behalf of a truly wonderful organization, CRDSA. I thought I'd be brief in really kicking things off. This webinar explores findings from CRDSA's working group's paper, white paper, a review of biopharma sponsors' data sharing policies. I personally think this is an excellent environmental scan of the current ecosystem. For those of you logging in who are researchers, I think this work will help researchers understand kind of the nuances of transparency policy and privacy elements that assist in understanding the impact and research utility. For those of you who might be listening in who are data contributors or potential data contributors, I think this work really helps to identify meaningful benchmarks to potentially guide policy development. So I think there's a little something in here for everyone. So back to you, Aaron. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Want to give you a little bit of an overview of Clinical Research Data Sharing Alliance. We're a multi-stakeholder alliance, and I guess the most important takeaway is we are not a data sharing platform, but we're a group of organizations that came together to represent the data sharing ecosystem. So as you can see, we have biopharma companies, service and technology partners, we've got academic institutions, and data sharing platforms like founding member Vivly. And with that, we hope that the recommendations and the things that we do are ones that really do represent the entire view of the data sharing ecosystem and all the different perspectives that are part of it. So what is it we're really trying to do? make it very simple. We're trying to make clinical research data easy to share and easy to use. I'm not going to read all the bullet points here, but to highlight one on each side of it, on the easy to share side, I spent 5 years at Roche and Genentech, and I was the lead for Datacelerate, the industry lead for Datacelerate, which is Transcelerate's data sharing platform. So from a sponsor side view, it is really helpful to have benchmarks, best practices, things that you can anchor policy to. That's not necessarily prescriptive that it has to be done a certain way, but it's really helpful on the sponsor side to be able to say, oh, most companies do it this way. And if we're going to do it differently, here's why. And so that's one of the things that in the data sharing ecosystem has been missing. And this project is in fact a first step in getting to that level of being able to create benchmarks, best practices that are generally accepted to help sponsors anchor their policies. On the other side, if you're a researcher, nothing's going to be more frustrating than going all the trouble to figure out what studies you need for a particular research application, put in a request for them, download them, spend a bunch of time data managing them so you understand what's there, and then find out that for one reason or another, that study has been processed in a way that it's not going to help you answer your research questions. So all that work, and then you don't have the right outcome, at least for that particular study. And so the focus here for us is high data utility. So it's clinical research data, it's data generated for clinical trials, it's high quality going in, but when it gets transformed through a data protection process, and we'll talk a lot more about that today, you can lose data utility. And in doing that, it can really impact research value. And so we're trying to ensure that researchers understand what they're going to get and get the maximum data utility possible out of the contributed trial data. So easy to share and easy to use. And before I talk about this particular project, wanted to touch on the other work that we're doing, just to give you an idea what the scope of our current work is. CRDSA was founded about a year ago, August 2021. We have 4 work groups. We'll talk about the third one, data protection, today. But the first one on innovative trial design has a supplemental controls demonstration project in non-small cell lung cancer. And that project is around creating guidelines around the use of supplemental or hybrid controls in the regulatory use in confirmatory trials, phase 3 trials. And so it's an exciting project that's really focused on the use case side of data sharing. Supplemental controls is probably across the researchers that we've talked to, one of the top 1 or 2 or first or second use case. The second project that we've got under our secondary use standards work group, earlier this year, we put out a survey, and I suspect some of you on the webinar probably answered that survey. But we've surveyed researchers. What do researchers need? And so that team is working on, has collated and analyzed all the results, and is working on a manuscript establishing a basis for secondary use standards. So if you think about what the work that we're going to talk about today is, what sponsors have said they will share, and this work is about what researchers say they need. And then finally, our technology and innovation work group is about to release a technology assessment framework. It's really a lens to be able to look at data sharing technologies and different data sharing technology approaches and how they power different use cases. What are the best fit use cases for those? And that should be coming out later this month or beginning of November. That's the general work that we're doing, but why did we undertake this, and what is the data protection team work group trying to do? So first, if you haven't downloaded the white paper, it's the link's up here. It's on the resources section of our website. But broadly, what the data protection work group is trying to do is help organizations promote broad data sharing with high data utility while maintaining appropriate organizational risk profiles. And so the team started developing a playbook that was a decision matrix. You know, here are the things that you need to think about when you're putting in place a data governance and data sharing policy. And in doing that, there was, you know, a light bulb moment that, wow, there's the information out there that sponsors are supplying on what they're doing. And if we collect that, then it gives us some things to anchor different parts of policy to say, most sponsors do it this way, or this is a common approach. Again, not prescriptive, but the white paper came out of a need to do that. It started as something we thought would be 3 pages long and a pretty quick piece of work. It ended up not being a quick piece of work and took us a little bit longer. We'll find out why in the conversation. So the white paper is intended to start creating those benchmarks to guide data contributor policy development. But also this is going to help researchers understand what they're seeing in those informational statements. So I'm going to spend a couple of slides just explaining what we did. Not going to go deep into the results. That's more of the discussion that we're going to have. But we started with determining what are our sources. And the sources for our analysis were Vivli, CSDR, Clinical Study Data Request, and YODA. And on each of those, if you're not familiar with the information that's available, got an example up here on the slide, but each sponsor supplies data. This is all publicly available, just a click away. And that data can be informational statements about when they share, kind of more data points, what they share. They share this type of supporting documentation, these type of data sets. And then also, as you can see at the bottom, there's detail on the data anonymization process. And in many cases, there's a linked document with a complete description of anonymization methodology. So that was our starting point. The next thing we needed to do was collect and organize all of it. Sorry about that. And so we had a total of 29 biopharma sponsors information, and caveats in the white paper. I want to make it kind of very loudly here. We know that some of it is out of date. Our work group is made up of subject matter experts in this and know some of the companies, and we understand that some of what is posted may not be current practice, but it's what researchers are going to see, and it's what researchers are going to rely on. So we only looked at what was publicly available. We didn't go out to any sponsors and say, hey, do you really do it this way? Or can you give us more detail? This is what researchers see. Then we collated and organized it into 3 tiers. And those tiers were pretty obvious breakpoints. No companies were close to a margin between the tiers, so they fell out pretty naturally. The next thing we needed to do was to synthesize all the information. And then in order to do that, especially looking at the data protection approach, we needed to come up with a rubric to understand what sponsors were saying. And so we used, started from a place that a risk-based data protection approach is what we wanted to identify, and then developed a rubric to be able to look at the sponsor statements, the supporting documents, and classify the approaches based on data protection approach. And we use the safe data rating to inform this, and want to touch on that because this had been released earlier this year in a paper by Steve Bamford and Luke Arbuckle. And while it is designed particular to a data protection and anonymization approach, we at CSDR found it a very helpful construct just to think about the data sharing landscape, because the context in which you share matters. And so on the left side, you've got the key coded internal use that a biopharma company would have for its primary data. Then you go to a number 1, and you can think of that as internal data sharing. So if you're a biopharma company, it would be your internal data mark, Data 42 for Novartis, or EDIS for Roche. And then as you move down, 2 is a highly secured and controlled environment. all the way to 5, which is more of an open data license. And this was a helpful construct for us because when we looked at this, not only were we able to cluster by tiers, but Vivly, CSDR, and YODA all fall in that number 2 category of highly controlled, highly secure and controlled. And that meant that the policies that we were seeing sponsors express on these websites, the information provided, is going to be to that standard of highly secure and controlled. So we're not trying to compare what somebody might have said they would supply on an open platform to what they would on a highly secure, kind of a level playing field, if you will. So it was the methodology that we took. We're not going to go through all the results tables in detail. There was a lot there, but from an example of what you will see in the white paper, you can see here data sets and documentation shared by tier, and then broken down by what the sponsors say they will share for each type of data set or documentation. And you can see it was quite interesting, and this is a fairly consistent finding that the tier 1 sponsors, in this case, are pretty clustered on what they share, and you start seeing those percentages drop as you move down the tiers. So that is, and I see there's a question. Yes, there will be a recording after the meeting, and the slides will be available. So that's an overview of the data protection, the white paper approach. And what we're doing, what I'd like to do now is turn to conversation with Liz Roberts and Luke Arbuckle, who are the lead authors of the white paper. And I'll start by asking Liz and Luke to introduce themselves.
Maybe I'll start. So Liz Roberts, my day job is at UCB, where I'm a data policy and data privacy lead. And then as part of CRDSA, UCB was a founding member company. I'm a board director on that organization and also had the honor of being the data protection workstream lead.
And hi, I'm Luke Arbuckle, Chief Methodologist and Privacy Officer at Privacy Analytics, working on safe enablement of data. So this is right in my wheelhouse, of course. I'm very happy to be part of the CRDSA.
Great, thank you both. So we didn't prepare, we have a whole white paper people can read, so we didn't prepare a lot of slides. We're doing this more as a conversation. I'm gonna start with, in going through this work, what surprised you the most? What was either a result or something that was that, wow, I didn't expect that.
Maybe I'll start on that one. But I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. It was surprising to start with that we needed to do it because I thought the information was already available and it wasn't, and it took a lot more work to pull it together than I expected. But I also recognized, how important words are, because even when we could find description across all the sites, any site in itself might be nicely laid out and describe, whatever a particular organization did. But then when you start to look across sites, as a researcher often will, when you see descriptions, maybe different words are used to describe what looks like the same thing. So that's kind of confusing. And then even more scary, sometimes it's the other way around and the same words used, but it means different things to the different contributors. So again, it really brought home an appreciation for me of how tough it can be for the researchers as they start to pull together their proposals, even though I know how much hard work goes in from the contributor side to try and be transparent and share information.
Yeah, and to build on what Liz was saying, oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, Luke, how about you?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Liz was saying. I mean, I've spent years working on standards, for example, and it's challenging. That's the biggest thing you face when you start working on like an international standard is the language. And there is a lot of variability, absolutely, because of jurisdictional variation, because of, perhaps risk tolerances, risk appetites, how you want to phrase things to a public audience, and that can cause a lot of challenges. What I find was also very complicated in this, as you start looking at the policies, and there's a lack of standardization in language, lack of standardization in how it's presented as well, which is a challenge when you think of consent, for example. It's very similar in that way. We're looking at different things as a researcher. You can imagine grabbing these reports to understand, well, what data am I getting and then realizing, they're all different. So you spend a lot of time trying to understand. And as a result, as you pointed out, Aaron, with the safe data standard, trying to grab that to sort of anchor on something so that we can at least say, okay, well, what are they doing to the data? How are they protecting it? We understand the data sharing platforms, that they're secure, but what does that mean in terms of the data? And it changes a lot. Is there an opportunity to get perhaps higher quality data? What are the implications of getting it somewhere else, getting the data maybe directly from a sponsor? All these sorts of things are kind of muddled when you look at these things. As we learn, it becomes very complex, let's say, to try and categorize, what kind of data am I getting? What are the protections around that? And maybe we'll get a bit more into that later on, but the approaches that are used really inform the statistical analysis I might be able to do, because it may completely change the data more in one way than another. A rules-based approach versus a risk-based, very different things. Trying to find that was quite hard, actually.
Yeah, that was, the paper goes into detail on how the rubric was developed. Let me follow up on that there. And from a researcher perspective, why you've touched on it, but could you expand a little bit on why understanding the data protection approach a sponsor takes is going to help them, or why it's important to them?
Maybe I'll start with that one. I'm going to take a step back as well a little bit and just talk about kind of some of the words as well that the researchers are going to see. That we tend to use the phrasing sort of data protection algorithm or data protection methodology to use kind of words rather than technical terms, because if you use the word anonymized, then I think there's an understanding that you have done something to the data that then takes it outside of the remit of GDPR, for example. I know in previous years, I'd use the word de-identified to try and be a general term to mean, we've added some protections to the data, but recognizing that HIPAA and other laws actually have a technical meaning behind that word, again, can be confusing for people to know what has or hasn't been done to the data. And indeed, de-identified data may also meet the requirements of an anonymized data set, but possibly doesn't. So again, there's all this kind of lack of clarity there. The researchers need to know what they're getting. They're putting a lot of effort into the research to actually put the proposal together. They need to know, are the variables still going to be there? They know it was in the original study. They can see that maybe from some information that's already been shared, but is that variable sex, for example, still going to be in the data set that they receive? Or is the granularity of the data going to be in the data set they receive? So if they need age, has it been put into age group? And then, of course, if you're going across multiple sponsors, probably the age groups are going to be different. So that then brings a headache when you're trying to pool that data. So for me, a lot of it is the researchers actually understanding what they're getting. And also, if it is still considered personal data, that's going to allude to the type of contracts that are in place and the responsibilities of them when they're looking at the data, versus if it's outside of GDPR. If it's anonymized data, then it kind of has a whole different set of considerations.
Yeah, if I can maybe add to that as well. I love the use of the term data protection methodology, because it's not just about transforming the data. So I think that's great that we're kind of trying to step back from some of the technical terms, some of the jurisdictional variations, and just say, look, we're trying to protect the data, right? And why is that important to the researcher? Well, I think it's important to the community as a whole, not just the researchers, but obviously the sponsor, the every sponsor I've ever worked with care greatly about, the opinions of the participants and of the public at large. And so be able to say, look, this is how we protect data, very important. But on the flip side, from a researcher perspective, there's also the, well, what kind of data am I getting? Why am I getting it in this format? Why are there perhaps restrictions on the environment in which I'm working, right? So it kind of educates a little bit and sets the stage for, look, you're getting data that's of a certain level of quality. In a perfect world, let's say it was a perfect world where everything's very clear, but if they're getting data, they say, this is a secure platform. I can't download it onto my laptop because it's in a secure environment, because we're protecting the data. That's part of the data protection methodology, right? It's not just about transforming the data, it's about protecting the data more broadly. And then, how does this data compare to internally what people are working with, or the data that I can get maybe in an open form, right? What are the trade-offs when I look at different sort of mediums in which I can get data? And so, you start to understand, well, I actually want to get data from a data sharing platform, a secure platform, because I recognize that means higher data utility, right? So it kind of informs them and gives them as was mentioned by a bit earlier by Rebecca, it gives them sort of an anchor point for policy as well to say, okay, I understand what I'm getting, I understand what what's going to be expected of, in that environment and of the researcher, right? There's usually sort of ethics implied in some of that as well. So I think it really helps them understand what they're getting and the trade-offs.
Right. Well, it sounds like as a researcher, you probably need to learn more about data protection than you possibly wanted to, but it's going to benefit with less work on that. Downtown, I want to actually have a question here to build on that, because as a researcher, one of the things that I think comes to mind is, well, why is there such a variation in how organizations approach this? And there's a question here, what is basically organization appropriate risk tolerance or risk level? So can you talk a little bit about why there is such a variance in how sponsors are looking at essentially the same set of issues?
Maybe I'll pick that up from the sponsor side. Obviously, it's up to each sponsor to interpret any laws and regulations, which they may do slightly differently. And then every organization will probably have its own risk tolerance level. Some organizations may decide to take on slightly more risk, to be bolder in their decisions than others. I think there's also the maturity level of the data sharing within the organization as well. I think some of the contributors have been doing it for almost a decade now. Others are still being welcomed into this community. So I think it's clear there isn't a one size fits all, which probably adds to why the researchers see the differences. If I can maybe explore kind of some of the considerations that a sponsor will have, or a data contributor, obviously it can be beyond biopharma sponsors. You're going to be sharing or reusing data in multiple places. As Darren said, you will likely be wanting to reuse that data within your organization. Different departments in your organization might want to have access to completed clinical trial data. You're at a minimum, obviously, going to be conforming to any law and regulation around transparency of documents and results. So on the CTIS system, on clinicaltrials.gov, etc. And either you're a member of one or more of these multi-organization platforms like Vivli, or you have a custom solution in your company where you just receive requests via your website. So you've got all that kind of input information is slightly different for each company. And so I think that then informs that some companies might say, well, we're going to look across all the different places we share. We're going to pick the one that needs the most stringent protections. We're going to do it once, and then everybody gets that version. So it's lower impact, certainly from a resource perspective, but unfortunately also, obviously, you're missing some of the potential utility in the data when you're sharing in the more secure environments. The flip side of that is you decide you're going to do a custom version every single time you get a request, every single time you share it somewhere else. You're then going to have considerations around resource, as well as maybe mosaic risk. So again, if somebody can see multiple versions of the protected data, actually, can they put two and two together and make some insights from that, and maybe perhaps re-identify some of the data subjects? So I don't think there's one right or wrong way, but I think it shows why there is this kind of variability between organizations, which doesn't help the researchers, I know.
Yeah, I'll add a bit to that as well. Part of it is, we talked about standards earlier, and also maturity, right? I think it's also about the industry as a whole maturing, right? We're seeing in the white paper, we discuss the fact that there were no standards in the past. There's guidance and there's some bits and pieces, but not as a whole, as let's say the industry as a whole kind of come together and said, this is the way to share data. Here's how we change the threat landscape in the technical jargon to protect the data. So in that realm of data protection. So this is part of the idea behind the safe data standard, was to try and rally sponsors around a methodology to say, yes, we understand there's going to be some variation, but can we agree on some principles behind it, right? If we're in this secure data environment, here's what we expect in a secure data environment. Here's sort of what we expect in terms of data utility, and set some principles up. And it's detailed, but it's not as detailed as it could be. But the idea there is to try and get greater standardization, just to try and facilitate a little bit more. There's always going to be variation. I don't think that's going to change. It'll depend on where the data subjects are, the participants, because that obviously has an influence. But broader than that, as an industry, it's trying to mature as well, and sort of find our tolerance as a whole.
I think it's one of the things that we're kind of inside it, and we make some assumptions about general knowledge of the landscape. I think it's important to say that all of these decisions that organization is making is against this backdrop of very unclear regulations. So it's not like there's a clear definition of anonymization. I mean, for GDPR, it's just not personal data. And there's a term of pseudonymization without a lot of definition behind it. And so the interpretations are different between sponsors. They're different between particular protection authorities in different countries within the EU. So I think you do have a complex regulatory backdrop that creates some of the variability here, and how far do we want to go with this. Do you see any hope for bringing that regulatory environment together to be more cohesive?
I know a few of us had conversations before and asked whether regulators could come together so we could have a global approach, given the World Wide Web, the clues in the title. When we put something out there, it's available worldwide. But we were advised, because each regional country had to apply by the laws of that regional country, it was unlikely that certainly soon you would get a global approach. But I still have hope that we can move more towards that, because you can't be forced to choose between obeying the laws of one country or another. You have to obey them all. And so how can you put information out there on the web so everybody can see it, being mindful of all the different laws and regulations, but also you don't just put the information there to tick a box. It's supposed to be helpful. So how can we work together? I would love with regulatory authorities that we can actually work out what is helpful to share. Can we do it once? There's obviously some great reciprocation examples now that we're between Canada and EMA around the Policy 70 and the PRCI. And I think that was absolutely beautiful, very pragmatic. So if we can maybe have more of those types of conversations, that would be a great place to move.
Yeah, I do see hope, but I'm that kind of person who always is optimistic. Having worked for the Data Protection Authority, I totally understand the pressures there. There's public pressure to make sure things are safe, let's say, protected appropriately. So that's always going to be the case, and it's going to vary based on jurisdiction, based on the politics. There's a lot of complexity there. But on the flip side, as Liz just mentioned, we got Health Canada, EMA having conversation as well. So we're seeing the regulatory side from a health perspective now stepping in as well. Take for example, the European Health Data System. I think it's system anyway, EHDS in Europe. There's big this is a draft regulation to centralize and share more data. Well, that inevitably is involving now the data protection authorities, who are also providing opinions, because the whole basis of it is, look, we have to build this on top of GDPR. That's the first thing they say. And now they're hashing it out a little bit with the data protection authorities. What does that mean? What does anonymize mean? What does, there's a lot of really good dialogue. It's hard, it's complex, there's all kinds of balancing factors, but I think that's really, really important that we're seeing the health side from the regulatory side also step in and say, okay, we have to protect, we also have to, have useful data, as Liz said. So I think that alone is going to have a big impact. So we're seeing a lot more transparency, a lot more discussion in terms of, well, how do we make this regulation so we share useful health data within Europe on top of GDPR? So I think that conversation is very helpful. There's also some new standards that are being developed. There's a new de-identification/anonymization standard that's being published potentially this year. It's now been approved. So, these little things help provide frameworks to get the industry to kind of align and say, okay, now we have a standard. We see what the regulators are saying. Let's start to align a little bit in terms of what this means for clinical trial data specifically, because it is different. It is its own specific thing. And so I think these conversations are starting to come together. I'm really hopeful for that, at least.
I'm not sure. I think this is one where maybe industry needs to come together, on the contribution and research side. And it's both sides, right? The contributors want clarity, researchers want data utility. And, I think the regulators just, they're operating at a level sometimes that it is not the pragmatic solutions direction that is sometimes needed. We're spending a lot of time on data protection methodology because it is how the core individual patient data is transformed. And we have talked about risk-based, rules-based. There's also HIPAA, which a couple of sponsors mentioned. And Luke, maybe I'll start with you. And could you talk us through a little bit? There are some questions that are sitting around, what drives data utility? Why, is one approach better? Why is one approach better? If I'm a researcher looking and I see it's rules-based versus risk-based, what is that telling me?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, so I'll keep it relatively simple. I think the first one you hear a lot is you've mentioned rules-based, right? So rules-based typically means I'm going to apply this set of transformations to the data, regardless of how it's being shared. So, let's separate out public data sharing because that is its own thing. But let's say within an internal environment, we have access, the sponsor, his own researchers are trying to access the data. We have data sharing platforms. We have things in between where, maybe they're downloading it to their laptop. So that, obviously not the same platform anymore. The rules base would be, I'm applying these rules regardless who's getting the data, this is how it's going to be transformed. The problem there is you're losing a lot of opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to say, but if, again, going back to what Liz was talking about in terms of data protection methodology, well, let's step away from rules-based and the thinking of this is about anonymizing the data or de-identifying the data and go to this data protection rubric and say, okay, but there's different contexts, right? Sharing internally, sharing externally, strong, secure environment, downloading to a researcher's laptop. These are all very different things. Can I use those data protection approaches, the broader landscape, secure the data, fewer threats, more useful data, right? I can balance it. And so there's an opportunity. We tend to call it risk-based. It's not my preferred term, to be honest, because, it's used in a lot of different ways to mean a lot of different things. But if we just think of it in terms of the context and the risks on the data, public data, everyone has access, lots of risks, very secure, I can't download it. There's fewer access to the data, therefore there are fewer threats, more useful data can be provided. You're balancing data protection with data utility. And that's really, to me, the key aspect there is when you're able to look for those opportunities to share more useful data. Maybe you start with the public data set to get basic aggregate information and trends and go, this is interesting data. I want to get something more useful. I'm going to go sign up on a secure data sharing platform and get the really granular data. Or I'm going to reach out to the sponsor and see if there's some way, I can work directly with them. There's an opportunity there that you can leverage when you go beyond the rules-based approach.
And maybe
Liz,
jump in as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm a statistician by training, so when I can put a number on something, I always have that level of calm that kind of comes as well. So, it could be if you do and if I use different words, if I use qualitative and quantitative, it's a qualitative approach. I'm applying a set of rules and I've deemed they're good enough that when this has happened, there'll be some sort of review. That's what we've done. I mean, it's the same type of transformations that are made to the data. So, IDs are given new numbers, dates are either changed to relative day or shifted, verbatim terms are removed, age is banded. So it's the same kind of operation. But when you've performed those operations or applied those rules, how do you know it's enough? And how do you know how much it is? Is it too much? So I think by having a quantitative approach, you preset what your risk threshold is, and then you can prepare the data with those type of operations to get just below your threshold or no more than your threshold. And I know there's some of the specialist vendors as well can offer that actually, you agree the threshold, they can then offer you, well, there's 17 different ways we can prepare this study to not be above that threshold. And so you could even then decide, well, for this type of disease area, age is really, really important. So give me the one with the most granularity in age, and that's the one that I'm going to share. Again, you've got to be careful about mosaic risk, but I think it gives you that greater flexibility. You've got greater confidence in the data, and you've really maximized the utility that you can get for the space where you're sharing, while also being very mindful that there's an appropriate level of data protection applied, because we always need to be very mindful of protecting the personal data of the patients in our trials.
Right. So it's on one hand, we have calls from often the same organization like the UN saying open science, share everything, and privacy is a fundamental human right. And so your data protection has to sit there and kind of data utility versus patient protection, and the risk-based gives you some.
I think I'll just have one point is that the whole of GDPR, it's around protecting the rights and freedoms of people's data subjects, data privacy. I don't interpret that as being that sponsors should lock away the data at the end of a trial. I think there is definitely an avenue for sharing, but it has to be responsible sharing. And I think what the quantitative approach does is give us a nice framework that we can responsibly share the precious data from these trials to try and support future science. So to me, that's aligned with GDPR.
And so I want to talk about, there's actually a question that's kind of interesting. So if sponsors agree a level, would that be better? Yeah, and I think we'll keep this a data protection for a minute. I want to switch to what's getting shared in a second, but what are your thoughts on sponsors leading this versus waiting for regulators?
So I know that there are discussions around a code of conduct currently underway, but also we have to, as contributors or sponsors, we have to conform to the requirements of regulators. So there's certainly been some thresholds provided for some of the public sites. But I also flip it. I don't think it's as magical as, if we all said, well, EMA and Health Canada said 0.09, let's all go with that for everything, because of course we're talking across our safe constructs about different environments, but also what does it look like from the researcher's perspective? Because 3 different pharma companies could all decide on the same risk threshold to share studies, but when the poor researcher tries to pool them, they find that age is still different bands, so it's really hard for them to pool. So I'm trying to think as well, what is the problem we need to solve? And I think it's how to make the data easier for researchers to use while ensuring that all the right protections are in place. And I don't think it's as simple as sort of saying, well, let's all agree the same risk threshold, and then that will solve those problems for researchers.
I think that is partly though what Fuse and even CRDSA and other industry groups are trying to do, right? They're trying to come up with common terminology. They're trying to come up with common methodologies so that we can, as a group, start to align. And this is challenging. I mean, anyone who's worked on standards will know you got a lot of people from a lot of different jurisdictions with a lot of different risk appetites and opinions and expertise coming together, trying to agree on, obviously we got to start with the principles, right? Because this is complex stuff, as Liz was pointing out. GDPR is big and complex, and we want to do the right thing in that context. We want to do it responsibly, but it's not just about data protection. And I agree, GDPR is not just about data protection. It's also about, it is risk-based. Most people would say that GDPR is a risk-based approach, and there's a lot of different mechanisms you can use. So how do we, given GDPR, given HIPAA, given, Japan, et cetera, how do we come together and find those principles? And standards are being developed, and groups like the CRDSA are trying to find those opportunities to move the industry forward to create some amount of alignment so that, as Liz pointed out, interoperability, it's important. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm hopeful that we're making some progress at least.
I'd say comfort in numbers. The short answer for me would be yes, it would be a lot better if we all, putting on my sponsor hat or data contributor hat, what do I anchor to? And I can do it the same as everybody else. It's not, I could do it differently, but then I know why I'm doing it differently and that I am either more liberal or less liberal, whatever that is. But, having those sort of almost a safe harbor to be able to point and say, this is how sponsors do it. It's one of the first questions you get on things like this when you go to a leadership team at a pharma company internally is, well, what are other people doing on this? Because you're looking for those reference points. So I want to ask a couple of general questions, and then we'll go over to the audience questions. From a contributor side, what are concrete steps that data contributors can take, today, tomorrow, next week, to help this situation and to help researchers?
So my passion here is that we're not on different sides. It's not a researcher side and a contributor side. I mean, indeed, many organizations are both. So I think of them as roles. And I really would welcome more opportunity to bring those different roles together and talk, because a data contributor can, bring all the right people from their organization together and create some beautiful plan. But if it's not fulfilling the need of the audience, in this case, the researcher, then it's not meeting its goal. So I think if we can understand each other's pain points as well as each other's obstacles, it's not always, somebody says, well, I need this, and it's like, oh, well, magic, we can just provide it. But I think if something can't be provided because of perhaps how GDPR needs to be navigated, then at least there can be an explanation. And as Luke said earlier, training or education around, well, we kind of do it this way because, and a recognition that maybe that isn't perfect from a research perspective. But I think trying to bring those roles closer together, because we have a shared mission, which is to support creating new scientific insights, ultimately to help today's and tomorrow's patients. So how can we work together and talk more to get there? I'd love it at the end of a research project if researchers always had the opportunity to say what went well and what didn't, and then as themes start to come through, maybe that shows contributors, these are the big areas you guys need to work on next. And perhaps there's something in there that really is straightforward and we could have a quick win. So I know Vivli already has a lot of education slides and meetings organized, so do many of the other platforms. But what can we do to really try and move that forward so we can move this needle together?
And in the white paper, in fact, there were a few things that were highlighted, and you mentioned it really early on, Aaron. It's being up to date in some of the information that's being provided. That was one thing, right, that we noted, because we know from our own experience that, that's how they're sharing the data according to this policy. That's not my experience with them. So that's one thing, is being more transparent, providing more details on the methodology and the decision making. It doesn't have to be a 100-page book, but there needs to be some framing around how the data is being shared, how the utility of the data, et cetera. As was mentioned early on, trying to find, is this rules-based? Is it risk-based? How risk-based is it? Because we had a lot of struggles with that in drafting this white paper, trying to figure out sort of what category it fell into. Need for more transparency about how the data is being shared. And hopefully that will lead to those conversations that Liz is referring to, so that the researchers can then go, oh, I understand now. And it's a two-way street, right? But I think it starts with a little more maybe up-to-date information and a little bit more information in some cases.
Great. Yeah, I think that concrete immediate step is transparency. Long term, it is having these conversations. I think there's also a contributor benefit. The more transparent you are, the more researchers understand, the less questions you're going to get, the less work you've got to do. It may be that those trials that are being requested, some of them, the researcher can self-select out and say, I don't actually need that because it's not going to work for my research question. So I think there are benefits on both sides to really bringing up that level of transparency. And on the researcher side, what can I do? We've talked about why the data protection approach is important, but in terms of understanding what I'm looking at, what the information about what a sponsor shares, as a researcher, putting that hat on, what can I do, very short term to improve my outcomes?
Making sure you understand what you're going to be getting helpful, because no one wants to, whether you're a researcher or contributor, no one wants to be in the project where after all the work both parties have put in, then it can't go forwards because the data aren't actually meeting the needs of the research. So do you know what you're getting? Do you need to go through, say, the platform, but be able to know that the variables that are most important to you are actually going to be in those data sets? Do you know all the processes within a system? For example, you can download your own analyses, but not the original data sets. Were you planning to publish? Does the publication require access to those data sets? I think thinking through the whole process, trying to set yourself up for success, that you really know what's coming, and that it's going to be fit for purpose for you. But obviously, the contributors, as Luke said, need to just help support that by maybe an annual review of information. Let's start now and have a look there. Is it actually, could we get someone within our organizations to read it? Do they understand it? So that might be a good way of checking that the information is there, complete and understandable.
Yeah, and maybe on that point, it's the first thing that came to mind when you asked the question was, could the researcher look at the documentation and say, is this rules based? Is there an opportunity to do more if it's rules based? Because I heard that rules based is kind of fixed, or maybe that's a little too much in the weeds. But maybe just asking the question once in a while, like, how is this data being protected and shared? I just want to understand, so I can, asking the question may stimulate a bit of a conversation regarding what's being shared in the policy in terms of detail, because the researcher's asking, obviously it's important, but I think ultimately the researcher really wants to know they're getting useful data. However, if they do see rules based, hopefully those that are listening will know to ask, is there an opportunity to get more useful data?
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out quickly that there's also variability in what supporting documentation sponsors share. So if you know that the CSR is important to you, or the protocol, and you can quickly see that a sponsor is said, I'm not sharing that, that also can be a very quick way to say, I'm not going to have enough context for what I'm looking at. I want to make sure we have time for some of these audience questions, because they're fantastic and more than we're going to be able to answer. We've got a question here. If you were advising a newbie organization, so I think this is on the contributor side, going through the setup of a data reuse program, how would you advise they go about it? What are the high-level steps they must go through to establish reasonable capability? And generally, how much time would that take? So basically, how does an organization start down this road? And we've seen, I think it's also pertinent because we've seen in the results that the smaller tier, when we look at the smaller tier, they don't share as consistently, they don't provide as much information or as much supporting documentation. So, top level, how do you go about that data governance, data reuse side?
So I think starting it now in an organization is very different than 8-10 years ago when it first started, because there is this information out there now. So obviously I'm going to say join CRDSA, but there are other organizations as well working on different aspects of the space. There's a lot more information out there, but the stuff that go see what others are doing. I say if you're a member of, whether it's Fuse, Transcelerate, maybe some of the trade associations, CRDSA, go talk to the data sharing platforms as well. If you're new, maybe you want to go through an existing platform. The benefit with the multi-organization platforms is that when researchers ask for your data, it's already co-hosted. You're not going to get into the nightmares of they want company B's data as well, and then how are you going to support that type of request on your own website. So have a look what's out there. It's a very friendly community. So we all want to share learnings, even the people who've been in it since the beginning. You learn all the time from everybody else. So have a look what's done. It's a pre-competitive space. We all want everyone to be successful. So you wouldn't talk about particular details of an algorithm, but you can talk about, well, you might want to think about this and this and this. And that will then help inform you into, you can then translate that, well, what roles in my company are going to be doing that, and start to then gauge out the time it takes. And we'll just say on time, it's probably longer than you think. to get it set up, but don't let that scare you.
Yeah, I would say step one, download this white paper. I'm not just saying that because we're on this webinar, but it actually has a lot of useful links to other information. There are some Vivly links, for example, educational links. There's the framework. You can even see in the table sort of who's sharing what. As you mentioned, Aaron, tier 1 versus tier 3 in terms of size, you know, there's some gaps there. And so there's some easy wins in a sense, like the ECRF or just the CRF. But you know, providing information on what data is being made available, updating policies, like there's some basic stuff that you could start with that you see in this white paper. It's well highlighted where there are some gaps. I think that's one thing. You can learn a lot just from sort of what other people are doing, as Liz said. And then there's, tons of information out there. It might be a little bit of drinking from a fire hose, but at least you start to see the basics, right? Some things should be relatively straightforward. You know, you should have a data dictionary. So, you know, include your CRF when you start sharing. Look into the framework in terms of, you know, the utility of the data and where you're going to share it. Is it going to be on a Vivly, for example, a highly secure environment? That should hopefully give you, you know, greater assurance in terms of, well, there's a lot of already things done for me. It's already protected, right? I just have to figure out what data I'm going to share, but now I have that extra data protection built into the platform. The challenge I have with this question, to be honest, is reuse can be different things, right? It could be reuse in terms of a data sharing platform, or it could be internal. Yeah, and so, you know, there's slightly different answers, but I do think there's a lot of good information in this white paper to get someone started in terms of some of the basics, at least.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the technology assessment framework. A couple of questions around what I think are around internal platforms, internal technology, and you know, I think those become important because from an internal perspective, the technology that you approach, that you take, you know, the nuts and bolts infrastructure is going to determine what kind of use cases for your research side are getting power. And so this is a way of finding that scope. It's a different level of complexity internally because you have to implement an infrastructure to support it, as opposed to relying on Vivly. And there were a couple of questions. How do we get updated? There's a newsletter sign up on CRDSA's website that'll keep you updated on latest activities. There's a question in here that I think we only have a couple minutes left, but it's a very good one. Of how does CRDSA differentiate from Fuse or the translated anonymization work that has been done in the past? So I can answer that, but I'm gonna do third-party voices, and Liz, maybe
Sure.
you can.
Well, I'll kick off. So I think one of the benefits of CRDSA is that it's got such a broad membership. We really wanted to reach across the whole ecosystem. So everybody is welcome to join and be part of those conversations. So that's not true with all of the other organizations, but also we've got our own niche, but then there are areas sometimes where you might have shared passions. And so, for example, we do collaborate and discuss with some of the other organizations as well. For example, conversations with Fuse to make sure that we are aligned, but we're kind of defining what deliverable we're trying to work on next.
And that's what I was going to say as well, actually. It's the bridging. CRDSA plays sort of an umbrella role, bringing in all these other groups. Because they're all doing, you know, I've been with Fuse for a long time, and they're doing very specific things that, you know, big deliverables, and CRDSA can use that, can leverage that, and look at what other groups are doing, industry groups, and pull that together and play that bridging role. And as we've said, everyone's talking, so there's no, you know, we're trying not to create new content that is the same. It's actually different, and it's pulling together all these pieces to try and, you know, create a cohesive environment.
Yeah, it's up to us to coordinate with this. I think just a reminder, I think we could keep going for a while on this. We didn't even, there's still more questions coming in, even as we come up on time. But please feel free to reach out with any questions. We'll collate some of the Q&A after and try to get back individually on those. The recording and slides will be circulated. I want to thank everybody for joining today. We had a great turnout. It's fantastic. And again, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And please reach out with any questions or to keep updated on what we're doing.